Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today is day 2 of spoiler season for Aether Drift. It was a bit of a slower day. We only got a handful of cards, but some pretty remarkable ones are in the mix, and we have a few special guests that we're going to cover at the start, just to get those out of the way and then dig into the meat and potatoes of the craziness that comes with the rest of the spoilers. Before we dig in, make sure you like the video if you haven't already, subscribe if you're new so you never miss an upload, tons of crazy content on the way, and catch me live Monday through Friday over on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/quarantinedcapricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. Now let's get through these cards. So we're going to start with the special guest cards. We have 3 special guest cards that have been unveiled so far, and even though these aren't standard legal, it's going to be super crazy to be able to play with these in limited, sealed, and draft, and just get your hands on some really awesome versions of some older iconic cards. The first one here is Guest MOX, a 0-cost artifact with imprint, so when it enters you may exile a non-artifact non-land card from your hand, and then you can tap it to add 1 mana of any of the exiled card's colors. In a set that cares about artifacts like this one seems to, having an artifact that we can play for free that can generate mana to maybe also line up with some of our other artifact synergies in limited seems like it's going to be really fun. Next up, we've got Sharas Ignition. This is a sorcery for 2 red and 3. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to each other creature and each opponent. This one will be particularly powerful if you get it in limited. Basically a one-sided board sweep, or at least one-sided in the sense that it dodges your best creature, right? You choose your best creature. It doesn't deal its damage to itself. It also deals damage to the opponent. A lot of times this will just end games. Which has me a little bit worried about my opponent getting lucky enough to pull this in sealed or draft and just being able to win games almost automatically with it, because they get rid of all the blockers, deal damage to me, and then smash me in the face with their guy that they used Sharas Ignition on. Kind of scary. The new art, really awesome. And the last of the special guest cards is Lord of the Undead. This is a 2/2 zombie for 2 black and 1. Other zombie creatures get +1/+1, and you can pay 2 mana and tap him to return target zombie card from your graveyard to your hand. What I love about this card is it points to the fact that zombies are going to be a very relevant tribe within this set, especially for the sake of limited and things like that. So I'm really excited to see what other zombies pop up, especially at like the uncommon rarity, and just how deep the zombie well will go for things like sealed and draft. Pretty exciting. I am a bit bummed out that this isn't a standard legal reprint, because I think this would have been really fun in standard. Zombie Tribal is like on the cusp, I think, of being playable in standard. And honestly, it might be with some of the new zombie cards that come in this set, if this card is an indication of how deep the zombie tribe might go within Aether Drift. So, I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. But let's get on to the new cards, the first of which is Cloudspire Coordinator. This is a 3/1 human pilot for 2 mana in the colors of Boros. When he enters, you get to scry 2, which is already kinda good for your 3/1 2 mana creature. But you can also tap Cloudspire Coordinator, create X 1/1 colorless pilot creature tokens, where X is the number of mounts and or vehicles that entered the battlefield under your control this turn. The tokens have this token saddles mounts and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. Really, really cool card. I love the fact that this card is just good enough even without the tap ability. But with the tap ability, it's kind of nuts. Basically, if this guy's already on the battlefield, every time you play a mount or vehicle, you get to create a token, a pilot token that goes along with it. So it's almost like every mount and vehicle enters play with its own dedicated pilot that comes with it. And that's kind of cool. You can also abuse this by using things that like multiply the amount of tokens that you create, like Mondrak and stuff like that. And just like a lot of cards in this set, this might be abusable with Agatha's Soul Cauldron a lot. You know, tap anything, just exile this with the Soul Cauldron, tap anything that has a +1/+1 counter to get this ability. Potentially all of your creatures can tap to make X pilots every single turn. Technically, even your mounts and vehicles could tap to make more pilots, which seems kind of crazy. I don't know. I am just on an Agatha's Soul Cauldron kick with this set. I think that card is going to be probably the most broken card in this set, and it's not in this set, which is kind of hilarious, but I have tons of crazy brews in mind for that card. But that being said, let's move on. Next up, we've got Full Throttle, 2 red and 4 for a sorcery. After this main phase, there are 2 additional combat phases, and at the beginning of each combat this turn, untap all creatures that attack this turn. This card is kind of busted. Getting 2 additional combat phases and getting to use all of your creatures by untapping them is nuts. The one big problem with this, and the reason why it's kind of a bit more balanced, is just the fact that it costs a whopping 6 mana. The kind of decks that are going to want to use this the most are the low to the ground aggro decks, you know, that are putting a ton of creatures out quick. But if you're that deck, you're probably just winning the game before you ever draw this. Maybe it's some kind of a crazy sideboard card to use against, you know, very specific mid-range decks where the game gets dragged out a bit longer than aggro's used to. Another cool thing is, at the beginning of each combat this turn, you untap all creatures that attacked. So, if you use this with Fear of Missing Out, and the Fear of Missing Out triggers an additional combat step as well, so you get 3 additional combat steps. Normally, that combat step you get from Fear of Missing Out doesn't let you untap everything, just 1 creature. But because of Full Throttle, Full Throttle's text will untap all of your creatures when you get your extra combat from a Fear of Missing Out as well, which is kind of awesome. It makes Fear of Missing Out just that much better. And in a similar fashion, it works really well with something like Urabrask's Forge, because if you swing in with your Urabrask's Forge token, not only do you get to untap that token to swing again, but it counts as another combat phase starting, so Urabrask's Forge will trigger again, put another counter on it, make another creature. By the time you're done, you have 3 Forge tokens, each one of them 1 power higher than the other, and your Urabrask's Forge has, you know, gone a whopping 3 extra counters up on as far as how many oil counters it has on it. So just insane gas for something like that. And I almost wonder if maybe this could be used in more of a mid-range style, maybe control style brew with Urabrask's Forge, stuff like that, to get value off of combat phases triggering without necessarily being in an aggro deck. Because like I said, I worry that it's just a little bit overcosted for aggro, but it is insanely powerful. If you get to cast this, you're probably winning the game as long as you have like a reasonable board presence. And we're going to have to see it in action, I think, before we can really judge it. But next up, we've got Hour of Victory, 1 black and 2 for an enchantment. It has Start Your Engines, so if you're not at speed 1 yet, this will put you at speed 1. And when this enchantment enters, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, and then at max speed, which is a speed of 4, you can pay 1 black and 1, sacrifice this enchantment, search your library for a card, put it into your hand, and then shuffle, activate only as a sorcery. So this is sort of like Case of the Stashed Skeleton in a way. It gives you a creature token, it's an enchantment itself, and then eventually you can sacrifice it for 2 mana to search for whatever you want. I kind of wonder if maybe we can use this in the same deck as Case of the Stashed Skeleton and just go really ham with Tutor Tribal. Probably wishful thinking. This is a little bit expensive for what you're getting. It's not 2 mana like Case of the Stashed Skeleton, it's a whopping 3. And that's why it's an uncommon, right? I think if it was 2 mana, it would probably be a rare. But at that point, it would be way too close to Case of the Stashed Skeleton. That being said, having essentially a Case of the Stashed Skeleton for zombies instead of skeletons seems kind of interesting. And the fact that it helps start your engines if you need to do that, has some extra value kind of built in. I really want to see if this might make the cut in some kind of crazy standard brew. But it will absolutely be amazing in limited. Like, this is probably first pickable in limited. Any kind of tutor effect in limited is insanely powerful, because if you drafted just 1 bomb, the more consistently you can get that bomb, the more likely you are to just win the game through sheer power and sheer value. So this card's going to be bananas in limited for sure. But I'm really curious if maybe we can use it in a standard brew. If you have ideas about that, let me know in the comments. But next up, we've got Voyager Glide Car. This is just a 1 white mana 2/3 artifact vehicle, and when it enters, you get to scry 1, which honestly is already kind of awesome. Just a 1 mana artifact that scries 1. It crews for just 1 and becomes a 2/3 creature. You could swing in as early as turn 2 with a 2/3 creature just by dropping something that's a 1/1, and you're not going to be able to swing with it anyway unless it has haste. So just crew the glide car, and that's kind of good enough as it is, but it gets crazier. Tap 3 other untapped creatures you control, and until end of turn, this vehicle becomes an artifact creature and gains flying. Put a +1/+1 counter on it. Really makes me wonder if this might be a new staple in something like Boros Convoke, where you're trying to go super wide with creatures, especially token creatures, as quickly as you can, and then get value off of that by either convoking them or using them with cards like this that you're tapping them down for value. It's worth noting that you only get the flying if you tap 3 other untapped creatures, so even if you get it to be a huge creature eventually with all the +1/+1 counters you're generating over time, if you decide to crew it the normal way by just tapping 1 creature, it's not going to have that flying, and it's important to kind of denote that. But just the fact that it can get flying at a moment's whim if you need it, just by having the creatures, which if you're using this card, you're not going to have a deck that doesn't have access to enough creatures to use it, right? So, I don't know, everything about this card is just kind of awesome. Also, a fun fact, the binary code at the bottom, if you translate it to letters, it actually says fly, which is kind of funny. I like that. But next up, we've got Marauding Mao. This is a 1/1 shark pirate for just 1 red mana, and whenever you discard 1 or more cards, you put that many +1/+1 counters on this creature. It also has cycling 2. Is this confirmation that cycling is actually back as like a build around mechanic in this set? Because we've seen a handful of cycling cards so far, and I haven't really thought too much of it, but this card in particular makes me realize that maybe cycling is a much bigger part of this set than I first thought. Every time you discard cards, you get to put counters on the creature. Cycling is going to trigger that, right? And if you don't need the creature itself, if it's later in the game and you top deck this, you can cycle it to trigger, you know, your first copies of Marauding Mao, draw a card, get more counters on those, and maybe even count towards some of your other discard payoffs. The more I see of this set, the more I start to realize there's definitely going to be some kind of a crazy discard payoff deck that's viable in Standard. The question is, will it be good enough? Will we get the gas that we need? I really hope so. That could be super fun. But next up, we've got Samut, the Driving Force. This is a 4/5 legendary human warrior cleric for 6 mana in the colors of Naya. This thing is beefy. It has First Strike, Vigilance, Haste, and Start Your Engines, which I'm going to be honest, if you're playing this and not starting your engines until you drop your 6-drop, you're probably building your deck wrong. But that being said, if you haven't started your engines, you do get to start your engines with this, and then it just gets really crazy and off the rails from there. Other creatures you control get +X/+0, where X is your speed, and non-creature spells you cast cost X less to cast, where X is your speed. Kind of insane. If you get to max speed before you ever even drop this, which most of the time you probably should, that should probably be the way that you're planning to build your deck. That's kind of nuts. You drop this and immediately all of your creatures get +4/+0, and all of your non-creature spells cost a whopping 4 mana less. That seems insane. If you're playing a bunch of non-creature artifacts that cost 4 or less, you could just play them all out for free from your hand. That seems nuts. If your Leyline Axe didn't enter play for free at the beginning of the game and it's been sitting in your hand for a bit, you could play that for free. I don't know. Samut seems like it's pretty crazy and has a ton of potential. It is super expensive though. So it's one of those cards where it could go either way. It could just be too expensive and not see play, or it could just be absolutely busted and enable some ridiculous stuff, and it's worth trying to jump through hoops to get to that 6 mana in order to play it. The jury's out, I think, until we see the whole set, maybe even until we get to just, test the cards for ourselves. But another thing I want to note about Samut before we move on, it's really cool that I think this is the first card we've seen that gives you value for speed that doesn't necessarily have to have max speed in order to get that. Even if you're only at 2 or 3 speed when you drop Samut, you're going to get some value, right? And I think that's really easy to overlook and makes this card better than it otherwise would be. It's not like, oh, if you're not at max speed, it's not good enough. Like, no matter how much speed you've gained, you're going to get some value off of Samut, which is really, really nice. Even if you haven't started your engines before you play Samut, you drop it, you start your engines, you're immediately at speed 1. So at the very least, you're giving everything a +1/+0 boost and reducing the cost of all of your non-creature spells by 1. And I think that's some very relevant, important information that shouldn't be overlooked. I think Samut's really cool. I'm excited to see if it actually ends up being viable. But next up, we've got Market Back Walker, because the Hangarback Walker went back to the hangar and decided to pick up a market, I guess. This is a 0/0 artifact creature construct for double X mana. It enters with X +1/+1 counters on it. You can pay 4 colorless mana to put a +1/+1 counter on it. And when this creature dies, you draw a card for each +1/+1 counter on it. Now, that mana commitment is pretty extensive, right? 4 is a lot to just add a +1/+1 counter. But when you think about it, you're not just adding a +1/+1 counter. You're adding a +1/+1 counter and eventually drawing an extra card for that 4 mana. And then it starts to get even crazier if you use something like Training Grounds to reduce the cost so that you only have to spend 2 mana for every counter you put on it. It's not limited to just 1 per turn, which makes it even better. But I think the what's most overlooked about this card is you can just drop it as a 2-drop on turn 2, and it can just be a 1/1, and then when it dies, you draw a card. And that can be really good in certain sacrifice decks. The ability to have something you can play on curve that's really good sacrifice fodder that will draw you cards that if you top deck it later in the game when you have a bunch more mana is way better than just a crappy on curve sacrifice fodder. Is actually a value machine where you can dump all your mana into it, get this huge creature that draws you a ton of cards when it dies. I think the fact that this card can be both of those things depending on at what point in the game it is and you know, the current board state and what's happening, I think that's what makes this card so good. And I feel like that's going to be easily overlooked by a lot of people at first. So I think this one's going to end up being a little bit better than people think on first inspection, especially in those sacrifice style decks. But next up, we've got Fearless Swashbuckler, a 3/3 fish pirate with haste for 3 mana in the colors of Izzet. It's already not bad, right? It works in Pirate Tribal. It picks up all of the Pirate Tribal buffs, and it's just a 3/3 haste for 3, can swing in. But then it gets crazier from there because it doesn't just have haste itself. Vehicles you control also have haste, which is kind of nuts if you're building just the right deck. But also, whenever you attack, if a pirate and a vehicle attack this combat, you draw 3 cards and then discard 2 cards. So you're almost getting a brainstorm every time you swing, which is kind of nuts, except you're also getting cards in the graveyard instead of back on top, which is in some decks even better if you're trying to fill up the grave. And I sort of love that about this card. But there's a lot of little nuanced ways in which to use this. It's important to note the fact that it's always going to count as a pirate itself, so you don't necessarily need to play this in a pirate tribal deck. You can just play it in a deck that has a bunch of vehicles, and as long as you have something to crew one of your vehicles, this can always be the pirate that's swinging. Granted, you have to put it in harm's way, and you know, if they kill it, then you lose access to your pirate. But if you kill it, you lose access to the pirate payoff anyway of being able to basically brainstorm every turn. So it doesn't really matter. So it's cool that you can use it that way. It can also just be in a pirate tribal deck, regardless of the fact that, you know, even if you only have like a few vehicles in the deck, it could work really well. I think the one card that pairs with this super well is one of the first cards that we saw in spoiler season for this set, which was Lifecraft Engine. That card, when it comes into play, it is a vehicle, and you choose a creature type, and all of your vehicles, including itself, become that creature type, and then it buffs that creature type as well, like an Anthem effect. So seeing something like that paired with the Swashbuckler, now all of your vehicles are pirates, so all you have to do is you know, swing with a vehicle, and you trigger the Swashbuckler, which is kind of awesome. I would be very surprised if that doesn't at least show up in some way, shape, or form as a standard deck after this set drops. Will that deck be good enough to stick around in the meta? I don't know, but it's definitely worth trying, and you should definitely expect to see it at least show up. But next up, we've got Kramos The New Dawn. This is a 4/4 legendary creature god for 3 mana in the colors of Orzhov. It has Menace, Lifelink, and Indestructible. What's the catch? The catch is that Kramos can't attack or block unless there are 7 or more cards in exile, which honestly isn't that hard to do. You know, play a Leyline of the Void, or just cast Sunfall on all of your opponent's creatures or whatever, and you probably fulfill that condition, and now you have this big indestructible Menace lifelink creature. But it doesn't stop there, because even if it isn't a creature yet, whenever 1 or more cards are put into exile from graveyards and or the battlefield during your turn, you draw a card and lose a life, which is kinda nuts. Now, it does have to enter exile from graveyards or the battlefield, so it can't be a situation where, like, you play a card that exiles stuff off the top of your deck and then lets you play them until end of turn. That's not going to draw you cards. It has to specifically be exiled from graveyards or the battlefield. But that being said, there's so many ways to just get triggers off this and draw cards even before it ever becomes a creature. You could run it in, you know, an Abzan Insidious Roots deck where you're already trying to fill up the graveyard and remove a bunch of stuff. And another thing that's worth noting is it counts stuff that is exiled that is your opponent's. So if your opponent is using things that they get value off of exiling stuff, they're trying to exile their own things, or even if they're using exile removal on your creatures, all of that stuff counts towards Kramos turning on as a creature. So a lot of decks out there use exile removal, use different types of exile, you know, synergies within their decks. So they're just contributing to making your Kramos turn on that much quicker, and I kind of love that. I feel like there's a ton of ways to use this card, and I can't even think of them all off the top of my head because the sky is just truly the limit with something like this. But there's got to be some crazy ways to take advantage of this. So if you have ideas, definitely let me know in the comments. Any single thing that exiles from a graveyard or from the battlefield is going to count towards this. And that makes me super excited. I can't wait to brew with this thing. I just think it's nuts. But that brings us to our last card of the day, which is Count on Luck. This is an enchantment for a whopping 3 red mana. Even though 3 mana isn't a lot, all 3 being red is a pretty strict hoop that you have to jump through in order to play this card. But there's a reason for that. At the beginning of your upkeep, you exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. So this is basically a Phyrexian arena in red, with the upside of you don't have to lose a life when it triggers, but the downside being 2 different things. 1, you have to play it that turn right away no matter what, and 2, it takes a whopping 3 red mana, so you're not going to be able to splash this thing. This needs to be in a mono red deck, or at the very bare minimum, a 2-color deck that only splashes a second color, with red being the primary color. The first thing my head goes to is a burn deck. If you can just jam this in the mid game in a burn deck when you're starting to run out of gas and your opponent's almost dead, you can just start basically drawing double cards every turn, drawing the burn you need to just finish them off. And it could be a really, really good way of having something at the top end in a deck like that that can just help you get that extra inch, that extra mile that you need to close out the game. But I mean, honestly, there's probably a bunch of crazy decks that can use this. I don't know if mono red aggro really wants it, but maybe. It's tough to consider, you know, getting that tempo disadvantage of having to spend 3 mana on a card that isn't going to do nothing, that isn't going to do anything until your next turn. So I don't really know if this wants to be an aggro. I feel like this wants to be in a mono red deck, but not aggro. And I don't know what that looks like. Maybe big red? Maybe big red makes a comeback? Or maybe there's some kind of crazy new deck I'm not even thinking of that this would be great in. Either way, red getting access to its own version of a Phyrexian arena is kind of bananas. So let me know how you feel about it in the comments. But that is going to do it for today's video. Very short video today. I'm sure we'll get a slew of new cards tomorrow, so look forward to that. In the meantime, please like the video because it helps me get it out to so many more people, and it helps the channel to keep going, so I appreciate it. Thank you. Subscribe if you're new so you never miss an upload. Tons of craziness on the way, and catch me live Monday through Friday over on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/QuarantineCapricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. This set's crazy, man. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.